Welcome to this focused exploration of the sources you shared. Today, we're looking at a case that, well, it didn't just make headlines. It fundamentally destabilized the political and legal aristocracy of Delaware.
Hmm.
We're talking about the catastrophic downfall of the highly influential lawyer Thomas Capano and the tragic disappearance of Anne Marie Fahey in the summer of 1996.
And this specific body of source material gives us a profound look into that collision between, immense societal power and this very calculated criminal behavior.
Right.
So what we're analyzing here isn't just the crime itself, it's the extraordinary high-resource lengths Capano went to in order to erase the evidence. And perhaps more importantly for you, the meticulous, legally groundbreaking process prosecutors had to follow to secure a conviction.
Our mission here is to really analyze the key facts, zeroing in on the immense legal challenge that the state of Delaware faced. We're looking at how a prominent figure was ultimately convicted of murder without the absolute necessity of a body, the corpus delicti, or a definitive murder weapon.
And that was a major legal first for the state.
It was, which is why it remains a central study point in legal circles today.
To understand the weight of this precedent, you have to appreciate who Capano was. He wasn't simply a successful attorney. He was interwoven into the very fabric of Delaware's establishment.
In what way?
Well, he served as a former deputy attorney general. He held the position of legal counsel to the governor, and his family name was literally synonymous with wealth and development across the whole region. His connections, his presumed impunity, that dictated the scale of the initial investigation and, frankly, the difficulties investigators faced in even approaching him.
Absolutely. And before we get into the details of the investigation and the crime, we must approach this analysis with the solemnity and respect the victim deserves.
Of course.
Anne Marie Fahey was only 28 years old, a young woman at the beginning of a significant professional career whose life was tragically and violently ended. Her identity, separate from Capano's machinations, has to remain central to our discussion.
And our review of the sources will help us draw a clear line from Capano's privilege to his psychological motive, and then, critically, it will illuminate the precise, painstaking methods prosecutors used. They successfully built an ironclad case, primarily based on circumstantial evidence and, well, most controversially, the coerced and eventually corroborated testimony from Thomas Capano's own brother.
Which required immense judicial creativity and investigative rigor to bridge those gaps left by the lack of traditional forensic proof.
Okay, let's unpack this by first setting the scene, establishing the rarefied landscape in which Thomas Capano operated. The sources make it undeniably clear that his power was generational. We have to start with the sheer prominence of the Capano family.
That family background is essential context. The sources confirm that the Capano name was dominant in Delaware. They were known for major real estate development, building contracting, creating a multi-million-dollar empire that conferred not just wealth, but significant political leverage.
So this meant that Thomas Capano inherited a world of access and influence that most people, well, they just can't comprehend. Exactly. And Thomas himself was clearly groomed for success within this environment. He went through the elite educational track, specifically graduating from Archmere Academy in Claymont.
And his career trajectory wasn't just successful, it was deeply entrenched in public service roles, which granted him this intimate knowledge of the inner workings of state government.
Yes, exactly. We see him listed as an affluent lawyer, but he held key public trust positions. State prosecutor, Wilmington city attorney, and the highly sensitive role of legal counsel to Governor Mike Castle.
That's not just any lawyer.
Not at all. This is someone who advised the chief executive of the state on legal matters. He knew how investigations worked, he knew how prosecutors thought, and he understood the limits and the loopholes within the legal framework knowledge that you would later deploy against the state.
By 1994, which is the time he entered into the relationship with Anne Marie Fahey, he was secure as a partner at the Wilmington office of Saul Ewing, LLP, a very prestigious firm. He had the quintessential image of power and stability, married to Kay, 4 daughters, immense wealth.
But the sources signal that this veneer of stability was already cracking. He separated from his wife in 1995, shortly after his involvement with Fahey became serious.
So that timeline is crucial.
It is, because it suggests a self-destructive phase was beginning, where his actions started to threaten the highly managed public image he had cultivated for decades.
Which brings us to Anne Marie Fahey. We need to focus on her role. She was the 28-year-old appointment secretary to then-Governor Tom Carper. This wasn't a minor administrative role. It placed her at the very epicenter of state government.
Her professional standing is absolutely key here. As the appointment secretary, she was essentially the gatekeeper for the governor's time, managing interactions with powerful figures, lobbyists, and of course legal counsel like Thomas Capano.
So their connection was forged in that high-pressure, politically charged atmosphere of Delaware's State House.
Yes, their relationship started in 1994, and the sources emphasize that by September 1995, Fahey made a definitive choice to end the relationship with Capano.
And that single detail provides the deepest insight into the probable motive.
It does. Anne Marie Fahey didn't just break things off. She immediately began dating another man, Michael Scanlon. For someone like Capano, whose entire persona was built on control, on dominance, and the expectation that his wealth and influence guaranteed compliance.
Rejection wasn't just a personal slight.
No, it was likely interpreted as an existential threat to his sense of self-worth and power.
That's a critical psychological dynamic to explore. This was a man used to winning, used to controlling the narrative. When someone refuses to be controlled, especially publicly within his own professional circle, the sources suggest that the response was violent.
The end of that relationship appears to be the primary motivator for the premeditated crime that followed.
And it connects directly to the sources describing his self-serving narrative, later claiming she was trying to extort him.
Exactly. That behavior is typical of high-control individuals who, when faced with rejection, instantly externalize the blame and rationalize extreme acts by depicting the victim as the aggressor. That really is the point of departure for the sources outlining the crime.
So the narrative shifts immediately from Capano's controlled world to the chilling reality of Anne Marie Fahey's sudden disappearance and the profound investigative challenges law enforcement faced.
This phase, spanning late June 1996, is initially defined by ambiguity, which Capano was clearly counting on. The sources confirm the date she was last seen alive, June 27, 1996.
They had dinner together in Philadelphia.
Yes, and after that, she vanished.
Her family acted quickly, though, reporting her missing on June 30th. And given her high-profile job, the case immediately triggered alarms beyond a standard missing persons report.
Right. The FBI was involved by July 1996, which indicates that within weeks, foul play was strongly suspected at the federal level.
And because Capano was the last known person to have seen her alive, he instantly became the central focus. But this is where the legal challenge truly begins. The sources highlight that Fahey's body was never recovered.
And that absence is the legal concept known as the lack of corpus delicti.
Let's pause on that legal concept for a moment because it's vital to understanding the complexity of this prosecution. What exactly does the lack of corpus delicti mean for a murder case?
Well, corpus delicti translates literally to body of the crime. In traditional murder cases, it requires proof that a crime actually occurred. If you find a body with a bullet hole, the corpus delicti is immediately established. Someone was killed, and a murder was likely committed.
But without a body.
Without a body, prosecutors face an enormous hurdle. They can't definitively establish the cause or manner of death. Was it a natural death, an accident, an intentional killing? The Capano sources confirm this precise difficulty. Prosecutors couldn't say if she was shot, stabbed, or strangled. They only knew she was missing after being with the suspect.
So without that primary proof, they had to rely entirely on building a case that proved Capano's intent to commit murder and his subsequent efforts to cover up that murder, which demonstrated his guilt.
And this difficulty explains the timeline. Capano wasn't arrested until November 1997, a staggering 16 months after Fahey disappeared.
That delay is a direct reflection of the meticulous, often slow process required to replace forensic evidence with circumstantial proof.
Absolutely. Investigators must gather enough evidence to show beyond a reasonable doubt that the victim is, in fact, dead, and that the suspect is the one who caused that death. They couldn't rely on DNA or autopsy reports. They had to rely on testimony and logistics.
The sources also point to the fact that they did not have a murder weapon. This is the second major forensic piece missing.
Mm-hmm.
However, the investigation found a way around this through Capano's other relationship.
Exactly. The investigation focused on Debbie McIntyre, Capano's mistress at the time. The sources clearly state that McIntyre admitted to supplying a weapon, a gun, to Capano. This admission was crucial.
So while the weapon itself was missing,
The prosecution now had human testimony establishing the means of death and linking that means directly to the suspect via an accomplice, albeit an unwitting one, at least initially.
this shift from seeking physical evidence to leveraging the human element of Capano's complex personal life, it really demonstrates the prosecution's resourcefulness.
It does. They used his multiple secretive relationships not just as potential motives, but as sources of hard corroborating evidence of the means of the crime.
It's a classic example in legal strategy of establishing consciousness of guilt.
It is. If a successful high-profile lawyer is secretly acquiring a weapon through a mistress and then meticulously disposing of evidence, it strongly suggests he was preparing for or covering up a violent crime. But the case remained precarious until the most critical witness emerged, providing the intimate details of the cover-up that would substitute for the missing body.
And here's where the narrative moves into the truly harrowing and, well, unbelievable details of the disposal, which are laid bare through the testimony of Thomas Capano's own brother, Jerry Capano.
Yes.
This part of the sources is what transitioned the case from a difficult missing persons investigation to a viable murder prosecution.
And the timing of Jerry's involvement is pivotal. He was interviewed and provided his detailed account in November 1997, the very month Thomas was finally arrested. This implies Jerry was likely facing immense pressure or, threats of his own prosecution for accessory after the fact.
So that led him to cooperate.
It seems so.
Yeah.
Cooperating with the authorities in exchange for some kind of deal. His decision to talk was the linchpin of the whole case.
Jerry's account began with Thomas confessing the crime. He told detectives that Thomas had borrowed his boat and, disturbingly, admitted to murdering someone who was attempting to extort him.
And there it is. Thomas immediately creating a narrative of justification.
Right, and that self-justification is key to understanding Capano's pathology. He couldn't simply admit rage or rejection. He had to frame Fahey as a financial threat, a dangerous person, justifying the murder in his own mind.
But Jerry's testimony went far beyond motive. It provided the geographical and logistical roadmap the investigation needed. Prosecutors alleged the murder took place at the house Thomas was renting.
And then came the detailed, grim account of the sea voyage. Jerry stated that they drove to Stone Harbor, New Jersey, and set sail with the unthinkable cargo, a large cooler containing Anne Marie Fahey's body.
This wasn't a spontaneous act. This was a logistical operation.
Let's detail the sheer effort involved. The sources mention they sailed 62 miles, a full 100 kilometers out into the Atlantic Ocean.
To put this in context for you, that is hours of sailing, deliberately seeking international waters or depths where recovery would be impossible. This proves deliberate planning and cold calculation. It counters any defense claim of accidental panic.
Just imagine the logistics. Moving a large, heavy cooler, likely refrigerated, to delay decomposition from a house into a vehicle, transporting it for hours to a dock, loading it onto a boat, and then sailing out 62 miles.
It requires immense physical effort and coordination, which is why Thomas needed Jerry's help.
The sources outline the initial plan, simply pushing the cooler overboard and letting it sink. But nature intervened, and the plan failed catastrophically due to the cooler's buoyancy.
It just wouldn't sink.
Right. Jerry reported that Capano became desperate. In a moment of extreme tension miles from shore, Capano actually shot the cooler in a bid to pierce it and force it to sink.
That image alone is visceral. It shows the frenetic state Capano was in when his meticulous plan fell apart. But even after being shot, the cooler remained buoyant. This failure forced Capano into the final, horrific act of disposal.
And this act provided the only remaining physical evidence. He had to retrieve the floating cooler, remove Fahey's body from it, and attempt a different method of sinking. Jerry stated that Thomas Capano then wrapped heavy anchor chains around the body before finally pushing it back into the ocean.
And this is where the circumstantial evidence perfectly aligns with the testimony. The sources provide a critical detail.
Yeah.
When Jerry's boat was later sold, its 2 heavy anchors were missing.
The prosecution used this detail to great effect.
They did. The missing heavy equipment provided tangible proof that the events Jerry described actually took place. This was critical corroboration, bridging the gap between an accomplice's potentially self-serving story and the physical world.
Beyond the body, Capano also had to clean up the crime scene. He involved Jerry in disposing of the blood-stained sofa and carpet.
Which confirms that even if the death was accidental, the crime scene involved a significant amount of blood, requiring a swift, covert cleaning operation.
And this disposal required a third Capano brother, Louis, who managed the family's construction dumpsters.
Right. The sources indicate this physical evidence was placed into one of Louis's dumpsters, and Thomas instructed Louis to empty those dumpsters outside of their regular collection schedule.
Why was the off-schedule emptying so vital?
It was a calculated attempt to break the chain of evidence. If the dumpsters were routinely emptied, there was a window where investigators might have searched them. By demanding immediate, unscheduled emptying, Capano was trying to ensure the blood-soaked materials were instantly compacted and mixed into general refuse at a landfill, permanently erasing the crime scene evidence.
It highlights Capano's sophisticated understanding of investigative procedures. He was trying to eliminate any possibility of forensic recovery.
He was. And finally, the timeline and location of the disposal were confirmed by an unexpected finding. The empty cooler, the same one Jerry described, was found floating and recovered by a local fisherman on July 4, 1996.
Just 1 week after Fahey vanished.
Exactly. This discovery proved Capano's method and his presence in the offshore location Jerry detailed. Jerry Capano's testimony, corroborated by the missing anchors, the recovered cooler, and the evidence of the large-scale cleanup, successfully functioned as the substitute for the missing body. It was this detailed, visceral narrative of calculated concealment that made the later murder conviction possible.
We must also consider the legal agreement Jerry Capano received. He admitted to assisting a murder suspect in disposing of the body and evidence.
For him to provide this detailed, crucial testimony, he must have received a guarantee of protection or significantly reduced charges.
Absolutely. The sources imply a strong incentive. In exchange for his testimony, Jerry likely received immunity or a plea deal for lesser charges like hindering prosecution or conspiracy rather than accessory to murder.
For the prosecution, this was a necessary sacrifice. They needed an insider who could describe the corpus delicti, the mechanism and effort of the crime, even if they couldn't physically recover the body. Jerry's reliability became the central focus of the trial because the defense would attack him as a liar and an accomplice trying to save his own skin.
We move now into the courtroom drama, where this entire disturbing narrative had to be publicly presented and tested. Given Capano's status and the lack of physical evidence, the trial became an immense, highly publicized public event.
The trial commanded national attention, running from October 26, 1998, for an exhausting 12 weeks. The length itself speaks to the complexity required to present and defend a case built entirely on a reconstruction of events.
Every single detail had to be painstakingly argued.
It did, because the stakes were Capano's life.
The prosecution's strategy was fascinating. They couldn't show the jury a body, so they had to show the jury the enormous, desperate effort Capano made to hide the body. They had to make the missing evidence itself a proof of guilt.
Their strategy relied on synthesizing three main pillars. First, Jerry Capano's detailed, corroborated testimony, making him the chief witness. Second, the physical traces, the missing anchors, the recovered cooler, the testimony about the disposal of the bloody materials. And third, establishing clear premeditation through Debbie McIntyre's admission about supplying the gun.
And they argued the combined weight of this circumstantial evidence was heavier than any single piece of forensic proof.
That's right. But the defense had to offer a plausible alternative narrative to survive. They couldn't deny that Fahey was dead or that Capano was involved in the disposal because Jerry's testimony was too specific.
So what was their counter-narrative?
It was a classic attempt at mitigating the charge from intentional murder to involuntary manslaughter or accidental death while shifting the malicious intent onto someone else. They introduced the claim that Debbie McIntyre, the other mistress, was responsible.
And the specific dramatic scenario they presented was one of jealousy and rage. They alleged McIntyre burst into Capano's room, saw him and Fahey engaged in intimacy, and threatened violence.
Yes. The defense claimed McIntyre threatened to shoot herself out of desperation and jealousy. According to their version, Fahey was then killed when the gun discharged accidentally during a struggle between Thomas Capano and McIntyre for control of the weapon.
So this narrative instantly reframed Capano from a calculating murderer to a panicked bystander involved in a cleanup after a tragic third-party accident.
Exactly. Which meant the 12-week trial largely became a credibility contest. The defense heavily attacked Jerry Capano as an untrustworthy accomplice who was simply lying to save himself.
How did the prosecution defend Jerry and his potentially coerced testimony?
Well, this is where that meticulous investigative legwork we mentioned earlier became so crucial. The prosecution didn't rely on Jerry's word alone. They provided corroboration that linked Thomas and Jerry to the events. They introduced records, potentially cell tower data, boat registration logs, financial transactions for fuel, that placed Thomas Capano at Stone Harbor, New Jersey.
And confirmed the date and duration of the sea trip.
Yes, matching Jerry's 62-mile account. Furthermore, the missing anchors and the recovered cooler were powerful, independent verification points.
And how did the prosecution dismantle the defense's McIntyre claim, the accidental shooting theory?
They attack the internal logic and the facts surrounding the cleanup. If Fahey was killed accidentally during a struggle involving McIntyre, why the immense calculated effort to dispose of the body 62 miles out at sea, shooting the container, and weighting the remains?
Right, an accidental death might lead to panic, but...
Exactly. But the evidence suggested weeks of premeditation in the disposal phase, confirming Capano's guilty mindset.
Additionally, the prosecution highlighted that McIntyre was only an accessory for supplying the weapon, not for being present at the crime scene.
And Capano never attempted to claim this accidental shooting until trial. His initial claim to Cherry was that Fahey was trying to extort him, which suggests a pre-existing motive for intentional murder.
The prosecution's closing argument likely centered on the unnecessity of the cleanup if the death was accidental. Why dispose of the body in such an extreme manner if the resulting death was legally defensible? The blood-stained sofa and carpet, which Capano tried so desperately to destroy, screamed of a violent act Capano wanted permanently erased, not an unfortunate accident.
And the jury clearly sided with the prosecution. On January 17, 1999, Thomas Capano was convicted of first-degree murder. This result wasn't just a legal victory, it was a landmark moment for the state.
It secured that crucial legal precedent.
It did. The sources emphasized that this conviction was the first time in Delaware state history that a person was convicted of murder without the recovery of the victim's body or the murder weapon. It proved that justice could prevail even when the defendant attempts a perfect crime of concealment.
For prosecutors facing similar cold cases or calculated disposals, the Capano case became the blueprint.
Following the conviction, Capano was initially sentenced to death by lethal injection. The severity of the sentence underscored the jury's belief that his actions were not those of a panicked man, but a calculated killer.
But the conviction was just the first phase. The legal system allows for intense scrutiny of death sentences, and Capano used his extensive legal knowledge and resources to fight that sentence relentlessly for the next decade. The conviction was solid, but the next phase of the sources outlines the long, complex legal fight over Capano's sentence and the numerous appeals he filed, utilizing every aspect of the judicial system.
We must trace this road carefully, as it involves significant changes in death penalty jurisprudence at the time. The sources indicate that years after the trial, in January 2006, the Delaware Supreme Court affirmed Capano's conviction.
So the conviction itself stood.
It did. They stated the evidence was sufficient and the trial was fair. However, they remanded the case specifically for resentencing.
This was due to a highly technical but critical procedural issue regarding the death penalty. The sources state that the sentence was imposed by a non-unanimous jury verdict. What was the legal root of this problem?
This points directly to the evolving constitutional standards regarding capital punishment in the United States, specifically in light of a U.S. Supreme Court case called Ring v. Arizona in 2002.
Okay.
Historically, in some states like Delaware, juries might issue a non-unanimous recommendation for the death penalty, and then the judge would impose the final sentence. The Ring decision effectively held that if a state requires a jury to find specific aggravating factors for the death penalty, those findings must be made by a jury, and eventually, the requirement of unanimity began to be enforced more rigorously.
So because Capano's original jury sentencing recommendation was not unanimous, the state Supreme Court determined that it violated the evolving constitutional rights regarding capital sentencing.
Precisely. It forced them to revisit the penalty phase. Faced with the constitutional uncertainty and the immense cost of holding an entirely new penalty phase, the state made a decision in February 2006 to abandon the pursuit of capital punishment altogether.
Which resulted in his sentence being commuted to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole.
Yes. While he escaped execution, his murder conviction remained absolutely secure.
Capano then shifted his focus to federal challenges, primarily seeking a review of his conviction through a mechanism called a habeas corpus petition. In April 2008, the U.S. District Court rejected his petition. What exactly was he arguing at the federal level?
In a federal habeas petition, a state prisoner argues that his state conviction violated his constitutional rights. Capano would have argued a combination of issues, perhaps ineffective assistance of trial counsel, violations of due process regarding the use of Jerry's testimony, or issues related to the lack of corpus delicti.
But the federal courts almost always defer to the state court's factual findings unless there's a clear constitutional error.
That's right. And the federal system agreed with the state. The rejection was affirmed by the U.S. Third Circuit Court of Appeals in September 2008, affirming the legality of the conviction process.
And this was the final judicial stamp on the case.
It was. The sources confirmed Capano did not appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, meaning his legal avenues were finally exhausted. After a decade of litigation, Thomas Capano's life sentence became absolute and irrevocable.
And that finality was realized with his death in prison. Thomas Capano died on September 19, 2011, at age 61. He was incarcerated at the James T. Vaughn Correctional Center in Smyrna, Delaware.
And the sources provide specific medical detail about his passing. The medical examiner determined Capano died of sudden cardiac arrest. This wasn't a death by violence or mystery. It was a consequence of severe pre-existing health conditions.
What were the contributing factors?
They're listed as atherosclerotic and hypertensive cardiovascular disease, which means severe hardening of the arteries and high blood pressure. And the report specifically noted that obesity was a contributing factor in his death.
It's a quiet, medically defined end to a life that had been defined by such public violence and turmoil. But the ripples of his crime continued to spread, particularly impacting the political establishment Capano was once so central to.
That political fallout is critical to consider. Capano was not a peripheral figure. He was counsel to the governor, a prominent figure in the state's most powerful law firm, and part of the political machinery. His spectacular fall from grace undoubtedly tarnished the reputations of those he associated with, including the governor's office and the state's legal and democratic circles.
It forced an uncomfortable public reckoning.
It did, about the potential corruption or arrogance festering within the elite. His crime served as a harsh mirror to the state's power brokers.
And even after his death, the sources show the poisonous dynamics continued within his own family. Following Thomas's death, his brothers, Louis and Joseph, engaged in a bitter court fight.
A devastating postscript. The sources confirm the conflict was over control of the family's multi-million-dollar real estate empire. It's reasonable to infer that the immense legal costs of defending Thomas Capano for over a decade, the financial strain, the shame, it shattered the solidarity of the remaining brothers.
Leading to a fierce internal war over the remaining assets.
Yes. And the sources also cataloged the extensive media portrayal of the case, which cemented the story of Thomas Capano and Anne Marie Fahey into American true crime culture.
The coverage confirms the lasting impact. Several detailed books track the case, offering intimate views into the investigation, including Above the Law and Anne Rule's bestseller, And Never Let Her Go.
And these books ensured the detailed legal maneuvers and the tragedy were understood by a mass audience.
Anne Rule's book was adapted into a highly watched television movie in 2001, starring Mark Harmon as Capano, demonstrating how quickly this specific narrative, the powerful lawyer hiding a body in the ocean, was absorbed into popular consciousness.
A cautionary tale about unchecked arrogance. And the case served as direct inspiration for major television crime dramas. The sources confirm it inspired episodes of Law & Order, specifically Season 11's Ego and Bungtown in its first season. This sustained media presence on shows like 48 Hours and the FBI Files ensures that the details of this unprecedented conviction remain in the public memory.
We've now completed our analysis of the sources on the Thomas Capano case, charting his rise, the calculated crime, the complex legal maneuvering, and his eventual death in prison. The story remains a testament to the tragic loss of Anne Marie Fahey and the astonishing high-resource effort Capano deployed to erase all physical evidence.
If we look at the larger significance, this analysis demonstrates the powerful role that specific, detailed, and highly corroborated testimony, especially Jerry Capano's harrowing account of the boat trip of the missing anchors, can play in securing a murder conviction. It showed the legal system's capacity to reconstruct a violent crime and achieve accountability, even when dealing with sophisticated acts of disposal designed specifically to circumvent justice by eliminating the corpus delicti.
This story is profoundly wrapped up in the toxic intersection of political power, family loyalty, and ultimate betrayal. We noted the source material's mention of the bitter court fight between the remaining Capano brothers, Louis and Joseph, over their multi-million-dollar real estate empire after Thomas's death. This raises an important question for you to consider.
Okay.
Beyond the immediate legal and emotional damage of the murder, to what extent did Thomas Capano's need for secrecy and his reliance on his brothers during the initial conspiracy permanently poison the entire family structure, leading to that ultimate destructive feud over the family's financial legacy?
That lasting financial damage is often the final bitter consequence of high-stakes crimes.
Thank you for joining us for this analysis of the Capano case.
Thanks for listening.